Thank you very much. Right, so what I want to explore in this afternoon's lecture is some of the movements in the university and the wider culture which attack and even threaten our humanity. And I want to begin with technology, because all the really interesting questions about technology are really anthropological questions. They have to do with our understanding of what it means to be human. Creativity and innovation are part and parcel of our human nature, and our thinking about technology must begin with a sense of gratitude to God for the liberating effects on human life of a multitude of gadgets, of tools and machines that we enjoy. However, technology in late modernity has ceased to be simply about tools, devices, and machines. Fabricated or artificial environments have now become our natural habitats. Technology has become our mode of being in the world. As technologies become integrated into every detail of our lives, it's through technology that we increasingly express who we are and what we want to become. And the world is seen not as a home in which we humans dwell along with other non-human creatures and in dependence on the Creator, but rather the world is seen simply as an amoral mechanism, what the famous German philosopher Martin Heidegger called a standing reserve of material resources that await exploitation in the projects of the human will. Now, cultural anthropologists will recognize this as an all-embracing worldview. What has changed compared to traditional tool-making cultures is a uniquely manipulative relationship to the world and a human-centered self-understanding. The world is emptied of all meanings and values, except for the meanings and values that we choose to impose on it. As the old saying goes, to a man with a hammer, everything is a nail. To a man with a hammer, everything is now a nail. It's not that we decide what kind of society we want to live in, and then we go about developing the technologies needed to bring such a society about, but rather we select things for doing simply because the technology for doing them is with us. Sherry Turkle, a professor of sociology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she's an expert on computer-human interaction, writes in one of her books, with technology, we have a tendency to take what begins as a supplement and turn it into a way of life. Text messages were not meant to disrupt dinner table conversations, but this supplement to talk became a substitution for talk. So in the technocultural worldview, life is fragmented into a discrete set of problems. And the problems are solved by applying techniques which can be potentially mastered by anybody with suitable training. So rationality is reduced to what's called instrumental reason. This tendency to reduce all of life to a technical logic is seen in everything from religious practices such as prayer and worship, looking for religious techniques to get what we want from God or the gods, to sex and to organizational management. Everything is reduced to technique. In the modern technological environment, we seem to have lost the possibility of encountering something beyond ourselves which might discipline and order our human making and our human willing. So technology has become self-justifying, carrying its own imperative. The more problems that technology brings in its wake, the more technology we need to solve them. So it's a never-ending spiral. Just think of the COVID pandemic. This is the 5th anniversary of the COVID pandemic, and how there was a global search for an infallible vaccine to grant us immunity against the disease. But the underlying causes of pandemics are the same global environmental changes that drive the loss of biodiversity and anthropogenic climate change. And yet those are not being attended to. So in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services held a global workshop. And in their report, they write, the business as usual approach to pandemics is based on containment and control after a disease has emerged, and it relies primarily on reductionist approaches to vaccines and therapeutic development, rather than on reducing the drivers of pandemic risk to prevent them before they emerge. So let's move to a second area, and that is what is called biological reductionism. It's remarkable how two of the greatest intellectual feats of the human species have become tools to shrink the way that we think of our own humanity. I refer to neo-Darwinian theory on the one hand and neuroscience on the other. So let's look at the way that neo-Darwinian theory has been conscripted into what's called evolutionary psychology. It is argued that many of our most deeply implanted traits came about when humans belonged to hunter-gatherer communities. This community had the benefits of language and tools, but not yet the benefits of law, of agriculture, of religion, which came in later times, when humans began to settle and to cultivate the land. So for the evolutionary psychologist, human nature is largely composed of these deep adaptations to the environment, and they are best understood as solutions to the problem of survival and the passing on of successful genetic adaptation to successive generations in circumstances that have now largely disappeared. However, all that we know about our Pleistocene ancestors, how they lived, is based on a few skulls and part skeletons and a handful of disputed artifacts. And yet even the humanities are being invaded today by pseudo-scientific explanations of this kind. The attempt to explain music, art, literature, our sense of beauty, to explain them as primitive techniques of adaptation for the sake of survival, this is silly despite its popularity. So here is a philosopher, Mary Midgley, arguing against this reductionist approach to human behavior. She writes, one way or another, the attempt to find an evolutionary advantage in terms of survival for every human taste, including, say, the taste for doing mathematics, for jokes and laughter, for music and poetry, for play, for sympathizing or for quarreling, has proved perverse and empty. These are things that are done for their own sake, because they fulfill our human nature. The tendency at present is to connect them all with evolution by claiming that they promote survival because they are bond-forming. but the kind of bond formed in each case is different, and the effects on survival are infinitely varied. This suggestion does nothing to explain the peculiar character of these various occupations. To understand them, we need to look at the distinctive part they each play in real life, not at speculations about how they might possibly have prevented some distant ancestor from dying. Another eminent philosopher, Thomas Nagel, an American at Harvard University, writes, "Evolution may explain why creatures with vision or reason will survive, but it does not explain how vision or reasoning are possible. The possibility of minds forming progressively more objective conceptions of reality is not something the theory of natural selection can attempt to explain, since it doesn't explain possibilities at all, but only selection among possibilities." So remember that, as Darwin himself pointed out, evolution has no explanation for the origin of life or the origin of sentience, let alone for the origin of consciousness, and then self-consciousness, which, as far as we know, is uniquely human. Raymond Challis, another philosopher, writes, "For most of its history, scientific inquiry has been driven by a curiosity that, from the biological point of view, is unacceptably idle. Knowing that the earth is flat or round, or that the earth goes round the sun rather than vice versa, have hardly given individual humans an edge over the competition from fellow humans or afforded added protection from predators." Indeed, it's the separation of the pursuit of truth from any practical interests, an even greater separation from biological utility, that is the key to the power of science. It expresses interests that are remote from the biological needs of the organism. So the distance between the knowing subject and the known world, that distance is something completely unknown to biology. Then let's look at what Challis calls neuromania. The neuromaniac's basic assumption is that consciousness and nerve impulses in our brain are one and the same. Or to echo a commonly held formulation, the mind is the creation of the brain. Some years ago, I came across a full-page advertisement in the magazine The New York Review of Books, in which a neuroscientist, Sam Wang of Princeton University, advertised his 36-lecture course on neuroscience. And let me quote to you from that ad. He writes, "All your thoughts, perceptions, moods, passions, and dreams are the work of your brain and your nervous system. And thanks to the exciting new field of neuroscience, we can, with remarkable detail, explain how neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, and other biological processes produce all the experiences of your daily life. Open your eyes to see how neuroscience explains such phenomena as making decisions, learning skills, falling in love, forgetting names, and more, with the neuroscience of everyday life." Now note the basic philosophical errors which a first-year philosophy student can pick up. The errors of confusing correlation with causation, simply because my thoughts or my behavior correlate with neural activity in my brain, it doesn't follow that that neural activity actually causes those thoughts or that behavior. And then confusing necessary conditions with sufficient conditions. Yes, our brains are necessary, but our brains are not sufficient for our mental thoughts and our behavior. And then confusing sufficient causation with identity. So the fact that neural activity is only a necessary and not a sufficient condition of consciousness is consistent with the observation that a person's behavior becomes more completely explainable in neurological terms the more damaged their brains are. So, for example, an epileptic seizure will fit more comfortably within a neural model of mind than living with epilepsy, which requires something to bring all that complexity together. Furthermore, if consciousness was simply brain processes, it would not be able to distance itself from brain processes to discover or to imagine that it has discovered that it is nothing but brain processes. In a novel by the American writer John Updike, there is a character called Dale Kohler who observes, and I quote, "Materialism, this kind of materialist reductionism, is a faith, just like theism, only it asks a bit more in the way of miracles. Instead of asking that we believe in God, it asks that we don't believe in ourselves. It asks that we don't believe in our own awareness, our own emotions, and our own moral sensations." So then let's turn to a third area, and that is the way that we humanize the machines that we use, and at the same time we mechanize humans. We live in awe of our machines, and we re-script ourselves to align with their functions. Astute observers lament this tendency. The computer scientist Jaron Lanier, one of the pioneers of Web 2.0 and virtual reality, comments that, and I quote, "People degrade themselves in order to make machines seem smart all the time. We ask teachers to teach to a standardized test, so student will look good to an algorithm. We have repeatedly demonstrated our species' bottomless ability to lower our standards to make information technology look good. Treating computers as intelligent, autonomous entities ends up standing the process of engineering on its head. We can't afford to respect our own designs so much." And notice the title of his book, "You Are Not a Gadget, a Manifesto." Similarly, Sherry Turkle, whom I mentioned before, writes, "Even before we make the robots, we remake ourselves as people ready to be their companions. Almost universally, people project human attributes onto programs that present as human-like. Then people feel in the presence of a knowing other that cares about them." And that's why people seek AI companions. So remember that simulating the behavior of a thinking, conscious being is not the same as actually being a thinking, conscious being. Simulating emotions is not the same as having emotions. However, by using a common language like information, intelligence, neural networks, emotions, using a common language when discussing minds, brains, and computers, the human-machine barrier is easily crossed. The mind now is naturalized and computerized. And the brain can now be described as an incredibly powerful microprocessor, the mother of all motherboards. As the famous philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein put it, when he looked back on the naive philosophy of science that he held to in the 1920s, a philosophy called logical positivism that had once seduced him and many people like him, he later wrote, "A picture held us captive, and we could not get outside of it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably." A fourth area, what I call the new Gnosticism. The blurring of the boundaries between the human and the machine has been taken further in the utopian vision that is labeled transhumanism. Here, our biological embodiment is seen as an obstacle to our intellectual development as a species. Ray Kurzweil, who is the director of engineering at Google, is the high priest of this religion of techno-optimism or transhumanism. For Kurzweil and his followers amongst AI researchers, human biology is a hindrance or even a prison from which we have to escape. And in this, they are the 21st century followers of an ancient philosophy called Gnosticism. Gnosticism derives from gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge, and Gnosticism was the first heresy that the Christian church had to battle, because the Gnostics believed that matter or the physical realm, our physical bodies, were evil, and salvation lay in our souls acquiring knowledge, gnosis, that was available to a spiritual elite, and thereby escaping our entanglement in our bodies and in the physical realm, and rising to a new spiritual realm altogether. So many AI enthusiasts today denigrate our current human condition and our embodied nature. One of the pioneers of AI at MIT's world-famous Media Lab, Marvin Minsky, called the human brain a meat machine. And he denigrated our bodies as, quote, a bloody mess of organic matter. He attempted to divorce the body from the self, insisting, and I quote, the important thing in refining one's own thought is to try to depersonalize your interior, end of quote. So the so-called transhuman person that's envisaged is something like a cyborg, an amalgam of machine and biological body parts. Our relatively slow neuronal connections will one day be augmented by emergent technologies in the same way that cochlear implants help improve the hearing of those with auditory impairments. One day we will think faster and more deeply. We will remember more, have access to all knowledge, never forget anything that we have learned, be able to share our thoughts instantly with others. Ultimately, technology will enable us to dispense with our brains altogether and transfer their content to more durable, perhaps silicon rather than carbon-based media. Now, for those AI researchers who fantasize in this way, human biology is a distraction, or like I said, even a prison from which to escape. So it's interesting that vestiges of Christian belief survive in corrupted and heretical forms like Gnosticism in the secular religions of the late modern West. Belief in a God who saves has been recast as belief in the redemptive power of technological progress. The expectation of the parousia and the messianic kingdom has been reshaped into the imminent arrival of the singularity. which is that pivotal point when, according to transhumanists, we shall merge with our own super smart machines and become new beings entirely, born again into a transhuman state. And books about this coming singularity are as common in science libraries or bookstores as talks about the rapture and the second coming are in fundamentalist Christian churches. So this is a new spiritual or intellectual elitism. And let me give you two quotations from critics which point out just how out of touch with reality these spiritual elitists are. The first is from a moral theologian in Britain, Oliver O'Donovan. He writes, "When I have entered my credit card number and double-clicked on the confirm box, some human packer somewhere has to act on my order. Some driver struggled through the traffic on the motorway. Some postman find my front door. For me, as for the slave owners of the early modern colonies, it's all too easy to overlook those on whom the gratifying of my desires depends, and to succumb to the illusion that the tips of my fingers on keyboard and mouse have freed them from the constraints of place too." The second is from Kate Crawford in a book called Atlas of AI. She is a philosopher and sociologist of AI. She writes, "Contemporary forms of artificial intelligence are neither artificial nor intelligent. We can and should speak instead of the hard physical labor of mine workers, those who mine lithium and the rare earths that go into our phones and our laptops, the repetitive factory labor on the assembly line, the cybernetic labor in the cognitive sweatshops of outsourced programmers, the poorly paid crowdsourced labor of Mechanical Turk workers." Mechanical Turk is a crowdsourcing platform of Amazon. "And the unpaid immaterial work of everyday users. These are places where we can see how planetary computation depends on the exploitation of human labor, all along all the supply chains of extraction." And then we come to what's called the post-human. The words transhumanism and post-humanism are used interchangeably in some of the philosophical literature on emergent technologies. But in recent years, the term post-humanism has assumed a more radical meaning, especially in the hands of ecologists, those who are concerned about how we as humans are destroying the planet. So post-humanism rejects the secular humanist project of the European Enlightenment and the Christianity from which it derived. It rejects it as being too human-centered. What they argue for is that we need to move beyond the human and to embrace a cosmic pro-life vision. So instead of being anthropocentric, we should be zoecentric. And in doing so, the borders or the boundaries between humans and other life forms are trivialized or obliterated altogether. There is nothing special about being human. Now, I find this post-humanism incoherent because one does not have to invoke theology or philosophy to point out that humans are the only animals we know who actually laugh at their own animal nature. They make jokes and also protest about death. They use tools and language in ways that no other animal comes remotely close to using. And humans are not only animals, but persons, each with a unique take or unique perspective on the world. We are distinguished from our evolutionary neighbors by an interpersonal intentionality. So concepts such as freedom or moral guilt or moral accountability have no place when we are describing animal behavior. So the post-humanist critique of ecological destruction is ironically framed in moral terms, in moral categories that are uniquely human. If humans are simply one life form amongst many others and evolved purely contingently, without any prior purposive agent behind the process of evolution, if all current life forms were to disappear as a result of global warming or some cataclysmic event, surely the earth will then throw up new life forms that can survive in the new conditions of the post-human age. So why should we care if humans are not unique? So it seems to me that the deeply ingrained moral sense of being responsible for life on the planet, that deeply ingrained moral sense is one that makes more sense within a Jewish or Christian understanding of human stewardship under God than zoecentrism or post-humanism. So just in conclusion, there are two interesting contradictions that run through our postmodern universities and indeed Western culture today. The first is a contradiction between determinism and autonomy. So you'll find some sections in the university, areas like in neuroscience or in evolutionary psychology, that stress determinism. Who'll even say that we have no free will, no freedom to act, because all our behavior is determined by our biology. And yet, when you move into, say, the medical sciences, the only value that is recognized in medical ethics, in secular medical ethics, is the value of autonomy, of consent. And if the patient gives his or her consent, then that's the only value that counts. Now that's a contradiction. How can there be consent, freedom of choice, if we are actually determined? And the second contradiction is what I pointed out between the materialistic tendencies of some ideologies, stressing that we are nothing but physical matter, flesh, neurons, genes, and the Gnosticism that seeks to escape our bodies and attain to some transcendent spiritual realm. Now, Christianity is the most materialistic of all the world's faiths, whether ancient or modern. The Christian doctrines, the core doctrines of creation, of incarnation, and of resurrection, bodily resurrection, these all emphasize the centrality of our physical bodies. Now, we certainly can and we do transcend the limitations of the body in religious practices or in music or in art, in mathematical reasoning, in the contemplation of nature, or the intimacy and ecstasy of personal relationships. But despite the delights of being taken out of ourselves through the creative arts or through experiences of love and the awesome beauty of the natural world, we still remain what we inevitably are. We are vulnerable living tissue, located in time and space. Our bodies and the bodies of our fellow humans are always with us, an inescapable concomitant of being living, conscious beings. So we are embodied subjects in relationships with one another and in a relationship with our Creator. And so I close with a quotation from a medical doctor in a book on bioethics. He writes these words: "The sheer nature of our presence, that is, as doctors, with the other person, can create interaction which is either therapeutic or disabling. In our body posture, our way of looking, our closeness or distance, the way that we touch the other, the timbre of our speech, we create confidence or we take away hope. Our bodies interact with each other for good or for ill. We can enter into the lives of others in an intellectual way, and this can be helpful and supportive. But more powerful than that is our physical presence. It's no accident that in medical practice, the most effective medicine can be the doctor herself."